So welcome everyone. I apologize for the delay. I have a very specific rider with Intertech and there were no M&Ms sitting on my desk when I came in, so that had to be resolved. It's been resolved and now we can start the seminar. So welcome. Today we're going to be talking about jQuery. The title of this is Understanding jQuery, and really this is going to be an introduction. If you've never had any experience with jQuery, you're in the right place. All right, so a little bit about myself. My name is Jason Shapiro. You'll see my email address written right here. If you could jot that down, that would be great. My email address is jshapiro@intertech.com. If you have any questions on the material that we're covering or any of the classes that we teach here at Intertech, please feel free to give me a shout through the email. We also have a Twitter account, and I would encourage everyone to follow our Twitter account. We announce things such as this free seminar. That's at Intertech Inc. There's the INC at the end of our Twitter account. You can also get there by going to twitter.intertech.com. I'll also give you some other additional resources at the end of this presentation, such as our LinkedIn page and our Facebook page and whatnot. So I have a little over 15 years of professional software development and architecture experience, most recently working on business intelligence applications. I previously worked on web applications as well, portal applications. Completed a Master of Science in Software Engineering, and in the early part of 2000 completed some of these Sun certifications, which I guess would be Oracle certifications now. So enough about me, let's jump right into the material. So here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to start right at the beginning. We're going to talk about what is jQuery. Why should you care about jQuery? Once we've convinced you that you should know and love jQuery, we'll talk about how you set up jQuery, how you put that inside of your web application. And then we'll start getting into the syntax. We'll look at the jQuery identifier. We'll look at a syntax of method chaining that they provide. And once we have a clear understanding of the basic jQuery syntax, we'll take a look at some of the different areas of technology that we typically add to our web applications. So we'll look at, for example, selecting elements. That's what we really spend a lot of our time doing. We'll have a input text box on a web page, and we need to get the value of what someone's typed in there. Maybe to send on to the server to get some more information. Other times we take placeholders such as div tags or span tags, and we want to fill in new XHTML to render a brand new page. So we do a lot of selecting elements, and jQuery has really done an amazing job at making that easy. So we'll take a look at the jQuery selecting elements section. We'll take a brief look at some Ajax utilities. After that, we'll take a look at DOM creation and manipulation, so DOM being the document object model, event handling, and then the stuff that people typically expect when they're downloading a JavaScript framework. And those are the styles, the effects, the widgets that you can add onto your web page. So we'll take a brief look at the styles, the effects, and we'll look at the main UI library that's provided by jQuery for adding widgets. At the end of the presentation, I'll give you a few resources so that you can continue your education in jQuery. And we'll have a little bit of time to take a few questions and answers. Again, if you have a question that wasn't answered, I really encourage you to send me an email. So if there were any topics that I mentioned in this agenda that you're not familiar with, maybe you're familiar with some of them and not all of them, well, that's okay. Again, I'm going to really encourage that you stick around for the entire presentation. It's a bit like a punk rock song. You know, if you don't like one, there's a new one coming up pretty quickly. So we've got a lot of topics that we're going to cover here with jQuery. However, if you would like to get some more in-depth experience with some of the topics we're covering, such as advanced JavaScript and the DOM API and whatnot, I'm going to encourage you to check out our complete Ajax for Java class. This has just been recently completely revamped, and in fact, this jQuery seminar is based on a chapter from that class. If you have any questions about that class, again, please send me an email. Happy to talk about that. And we also offer a complete Ajax for .NET course. If you're not coming from the Java background, the outline for that class is available at the Intertech website, intertech.com. All right, so let's jump into it. What is jQuery? Why should you care? Now, I want you to take a look at the logo that you see here, jQuery, write less, do more. That's really going to be the theme of today's presentation. In fact, I'm probably going to say write less, do more over and over and over again, because that's what jQuery is about. But jQuery is not a new programming language. You're not going to have functionality added to your web pages that you weren't able to do with, say, traditional JavaScript and CSS and XHTML. This is all just about taking what we do and making it simpler. Let's reduce the amount of code that we want to write. So jQuery is about 4 years old. It was released in 2006. It is an open source JavaScript framework, and it does have a large number of widgets and third-party plugins. Again, the motto, write less, do more, that's really what jQuery is about. The framework is free. It's licensed under the MIT GNU General Public License, version 2. And in terms of the browsers it supports a whole mess of browsers. Firefox 2.0 and greater, IE 6 and greater, Safari 3 and greater, Opera 9 and greater, and Chrome 1 and greater. So, why are we talking about jQuery? Why aren't we talking about some other framework today? Well, really, at this point, jQuery is probably arguably the most popular JavaScript framework available. Now, it's a little bit hard to justify that, but there are a lot of stats websites out there that are echoing this sentiment. In fact, one that I recently visited this month, I have a URL down there, trends.builtwith.com/JavaScript, listed jQuery as the most detected JavaScript library in use on the web, and it was by a wide margin. So that's why we're talking about jQuery. jQuery was created by John Resig, and if you're interested in his development team and some of the other projects that they're working on, or maybe you want to check out their blogs or Twitter accounts, you can find out a whole bunch of information on them over at jQuery.org/team. So that's what jQuery is. Now let's talk about setting everything up. What do we do here to set things up? For the setup, you are going to go to the jQuery website, jQuery.com, and you'll notice a link that says grab the latest version. And they give you two different options, a production option and a development option. So the production version is really just the smallest file possible. They're both, the production and the development version, are the exact same API. There's no functionality difference. The only difference is that if you look at the code, the production version is going to have all the comments removed. It's going to have very small identifiers. All the white space has been compressed. So the goal of the production version is simply to have as small of a download as possible. Whereas the development version is a little bit more human readable. So I've got a screenshot right here where you can see a small example of what that might look like. You'll notice it's just formatted a little easier to read. There are comments. The identifiers are human readable. And it's really if you want to kind of know what's going on underneath the covers. Now, of course, just as a general best practice when you're using someone else's library, you may not want to rely on what's going on under the covers. The only things we're really guaranteed from any of these libraries that we're using, and barely guaranteed at that, unfortunately, is the interface that they're providing. What methods do they tell us that we can call? What parameters should we be passing in? And what do they say they're going to return? If we start to find little tricks and hooks inside of the code itself, we may find ourselves in trouble by the time the next update comes out. So which one should you use? The name suggests exactly what you should use. If you're going to be doing development, feel free to look at the development version. Otherwise, just download the small one, which is the production version. Once you've downloaded this, and by the way, what you're downloading is simply a JavaScript file. That's all it is. That's your whole framework. So what do you do once you have a JavaScript file? You need to add it to your web content. And the way that we do that is simply by adding a script tag. So you see here an example of an HTML page, and I have the script tag where I've added jQuery-1.4.2 min.js. That happens to be the version and the name of the file I downloaded, and that's it. Now you're ready to use jQuery. Now, as just a slight best practice, you may want to consider changing the name of that file to something more generic, like just jQuery.js. The pros are kind of obvious. If you have hundreds of web pages and you have a versioned name of your jQuery JavaScript file, well, as soon as you upgrade, you're going to need to go in all of those different pages and change the name of the file. If you just use a more generic jQuery.js, all you're going to have to do is, once you download a new file, then you're just going to have to simply change the name of the file to jQuery.js instead of going into all of your web pages and updating those links. So that's, obviously a nice feature, but the cons of that, sometimes you can run into caching problems there. The browser may think that they've already downloaded jQuery.js and they continue to use some old version of jQuery. And there are tricks that you can do, lots of different tricks. Lots of websites suggest different approaches for dealing with caching issues. This is not unique to jQuery. This is just a general problem with client-side code for web applications. One trick that some people will do is to add a query string. And so, of course, a query string is just a question mark followed by some data. And in the query string, you can add some sort of a unique ID. I'll show you an example here that happens to be a JSP example, but you can obviously approach this with any sort of dynamic client-side language. So it could be PHP or ASP. In this case, I've got jQuery.js question marks. I'm starting my query string, and I'm just putting in the current time in milliseconds. So what that does is it tells the browser, hey, when you're trying to get this jQuery file, look, it's actually a unique link. You haven't gone to this exact link before because of the query string, because of the time in milliseconds. And when that gets sent over to the server is just going to ignore the query string. So it tends to be a nice strategy for dealing with caching issues. So we've got jQuery, we've downloaded the appropriate version, we've added it to our web application. Let's take a look now at what we need to do in our code. And we'll start with the jQuery identifiers. Basically, everything you're going to be calling in jQuery is going to be provided through a single object, a jQuery object. And there are two different identifiers that you can use to access this object. There's the $, and then the word jQuery. So both of those identifiers access the same object. You can choose whichever one you want, but obviously if you use the $, that's going to result in more compact code. So you'll see two examples here where I have a $.sum method and jQuery.sum method. Exactly the same. They're going to go and call the same method. It's just whatever you choose. Sometimes, though, you don't have the option to use, say, the $, because you have old legacy code that perhaps uses the $ as an identifier, maybe for a variable or a function or an object, or perhaps you're using some other third-party library in your web application that also uses the $, as an identifier. If you need to release jQuery's hold on that identifier so it doesn't break your other code, you can call $.noConflict. As soon as you do that, it releases its hold of the $ identifier, and now you can use jQuery as your new identifier. But sometimes even that's not good enough, and you want to have your own identifier to be used for all of your jQuery calls. In which case, you should note that the noConflict method will return a handle to the jQuery object. So if I do something like var jq equals $.noConflict, what's going to happen is it's going to release the $ identifier from jQuery, and now I can start to refer to the jQuery code through the JQ identifier I put right here. So here you see I now use jq.sum method. So which strategy is the best? It really doesn't matter. It's whatever you need to do. Just pick a single identifier and use it consistently to improve readability and, of course, maintenance. Another bit of syntax is the idea of method chaining. So you'll notice that, having a little control over here. Sorry, my presentation has a mind of its own. So with method chaining, you're able to reuse a return value of a method to call another method. And what I mean by that is, take a look at our first code example. You'll see I have $.a method, $.another method, $.yet another method. So, your code can start to become very, very repetitive. And if you want to reduce that redundancy, that repetition, you'll see an example below where I'm able to call a method, and then right after that, I'm able to put $.another method and dot yet another method. That's because many of the methods that you'll call in jQuery will return a handle back to itself. And where you typically see this sort of a compactness of method chaining being applied is, let's say you're grabbing an element and you're doing a whole bunch of different style changes and maybe adding a couple of event handlers. We're going to see examples of this coming up, but that's an example where you'll typically see this method chaining being used. The final third example I have on the bottom is just sort of an example of how crazy, method nesting and chaining can get. So clearly, if you start to see something that resembles what you see down here in the third line, you may want to decide just to, hey, let's go with a little bit of redundancy so we can provide some clarity to our code. Again, that's not a jQuery best practice. That's just a general coding best practice. So that's the general ideas with the syntax of jQuery. So let's look into some functionality. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, one of the things that we do the most when we're dealing with client-side code is handling elements, selecting elements. Again, we may want to read some value that's inside of an element so that we can send it on its way to a server, or maybe we have some placeholders in there where we're able to write into our whatever code we may have received from like an Ajax request and pop that into our page so we have some new graphical data to display. So let's look at how we deal with selecting elements. And before we look at jQuery, and this is something I'm going to do throughout the presentation, I'm going to show you how we handle this with traditional JavaScript. And then I will compare and contrast that to what you do in jQuery. Again, really to emphasize the benefit of write less, do more. So here's an example where I have a real simple input box. It's a text box. It has an ID, a first name. And if I wanted to get a handle to that text box, I would simply use document.getElement by ID and pass in the name first name. That's a very, very common method for grabbing a hold of an element. Another common method is to locate a target node, once I have one, and traverse the DOM tree. So here's an example of that, and ignore most of this code. Let's see if I can get a pointer going. Here we go. So ignore most of this code except for where I'm pointing right now. This is really the end result of this is a callback function from an Ajax request. But what I want you to pretend is that that XML DOM variable is really just a handle to an entire XML tree that I want to start to traverse. And so what I could do is that once I have that handle, I can say, from that DOM, I want to get to the first child, and from that first child, I want its first child, and then I can get out whatever other information I need that's traversing a DOM tree using the DOM API. So those are a couple of common ways that with traditional JavaScript that we're able to select and find elements on a page or in an XML document. Now jQuery simplifies this syntax by implementing a syntax that's based on cascading style sheets, so CSS. If you've used CSS before, you should remember that there's really three main types of selectors that you're going to look for: elements, IDs, and class. So consider the following example. I have a div ID here, and the ID for the div is employee search, and below that I have two different input tags, one with an ID of employee ID and division ID, so real simple HTML snippet. And if I wanted to select and change how those elements looked, one example I could use here is in my CSS. I could say, hey, for this div, I want you to select the div that has the ID of employee search. That's what that # is for. And below that, I want any children that are of the type input. So the element is an input. And if that, after you selected all of those tags, change the color to be blue. So again, this is just regular CSS. Another way, if I wanted to get a single input tag, I would use the #employee ID. Again, that means grab the element with the ID, employee ID, and in this case, I'm changing the background color to be white. So again, real simple HTML snippets with some simple CSS. But we'll see that in jQuery, that's exactly what they used. So here's my jQuery, and remember, the format is whenever I want to use, whenever I want to grab a jQuery function or method, I'm going to use that $, or I'm going to use jQuery, or whatever you've decided to use as your identifier. So I have $, and I pass in div pound employee search space input, just like we saw before, and that will select both input tags. Or if I wanted to grab that single input tag, it'd be the pound employee ID. Now notice that I've wrapped the selector with quotes. It can either be single quotes, it can be double quotes. Make sure you do that, otherwise it's not going to match any of the elements on your page. So the point being that this way that we're selecting elements is exactly like CSS. Now you may be asking, why is that so great? What's the power there? Well, we'll look at some of the filters coming up, and that shows the real power of using CSS. You should know that in recent versions of popular browsers, this approach has been adopted. And so in modern browsers like IE8 and Firefox 3.1, you can actually use this CSS style method of selection. You have two different methods available on the document object. Query selector, where you pass in your selector. That's where you will retrieve a single element. Or if you want to retrieve a set of elements, use query selector all. So if other browsers provide this, then why do we care about jQuery? What is jQuery providing for us? Well, besides having only a single method to call instead of the two that you're seeing here, you're able to apply the selector API to all the browsers that jQuery supports. So if you're trying to support IE6, you'll be able to use this selection API. In fact, the selection API is so powerful on its own that it's actually its own project. It's called Sizzle. So let's say you decide jQuery isn't for you, but you were interested in the selector API. You can actually download this on its own. It's available at sizzlejs.com. All right, so again, let's get into sort of the power of selecting elements. And that power is really going to come from filtering. So whenever I select a set of elements, each of those elements is going to be given an index. So the first element is going to have an index of 0, the next element is going to have an index of 1, and that gives me a way that I can grab a subset of the elements that I initially selected. And again, that's known as filtering, and we're filtering on the elements. So you put your element that you're going to be used, a colon, and then you use one of these selector filters. And I list a few of the popular ones here. Let me show you some actual concrete examples. So here's, again, a very simple snippet of HTML. You notice that I just have a bunch of div tags. The top 3 div tags have an attribute, an ID attribute. And you'll notice that there's a little bit of stuff happening with the value of that attribute, but that's coming up for an example coming up. Also, as we look at some of these examples, you'll see a method that I'm using called CSS. We're going to talk more about styles at the end of the presentation, but for now, just accept that the CSS method will take all the elements in that set that we've selected, and it'll apply some sort of style to it. So when you see that method, that's all that it's doing. All right, so here's an example of equals. Here's my XHTML at the top of the example, and at the very bottom, right down here, you'll see where I'm actually doing my jQuery. So the first part is I pass in the elements that I want to select. I want the div tags from this document that equals 2. So what is it going to do? It's going to select all of those div tags, and it's only going to grab element with the index of number 2. After that, I'm calling the CSS method I just mentioned. And over on the right, you'll see what that would look like. So there, I was able to grab a set and quickly just grab a single element. That's the equals. There's also greater than. So if I want to grab a whole set of elements, that's again a subset of my original selection, I can do something like this, where I grab my div and I say I want to select all the elements that are greater than the 3rd indexed element. So that will return us a set which would be number 4 through number 7. In this case, it changes all of those red. Now, you may already be getting a sense of the power of jQuery. You'll notice that I didn't have to call that method CSS over and over again on all the elements. I'll be coming up to a section on why that works. Another example, here I'm calling odd on all my div elements. It selects all the odd elements, changes the background color. And here is one called contains. So here it's actually looking at the text of the node. And so I can say, hey, if it contains some text, in this case the words this is, then I want to change the background color. So again, a few examples of selecting some elements here. Let's go a little further. So what we can do besides filtering on elements is we can filter on attributes. I can filter, for example, just to make sure, hey, only give me an element if it contains this attribute name. Or I could say, I will only give me an element if it has the attribute name and it equals a certain string. Or if it starts with a certain string, or if it ends with a certain string. So here are some examples of that. We'll look at a little bit of code. So here's a way that I can say, I want to grab all the div tags that have an attribute named ID. So how do I do that? I say, got my div that I want to grab, that's the element name, and then the square brackets, I just simply give the key, the name of the attribute that I want to exist. We're not really worried about what the value of that attribute is. We're just saying, hey, just return to me the ones that contain that particular attribute. In this case, it grabs the first three since they have the ID attribute. Another example, I want something that has the attribute of an ID, but it starts with the text number. Now, if you look at the example here for the first three, we have the word number for the first one. We have number on the second one. We also have the text number for the third, but it doesn't start with the word number. So in this case, I say here, grab the div. I want it to have the attribute of ID, and this caret equals means starts with. So I want it to start with number. And there you can see on the right side that it's grabbed the first two elements. Here's one where I say, I don't really care where the text is, but I want this text to appear somewhere inside of the value. So I use the star equals syntax and the word that I want. So now it's going to grab the number 1 and number 2 because both of those contain the attribute ID and they have the text section in there somewhere. So that's a few examples of selecting elements. Besides offering that rich and compact selector API, jQuery is going to reduce the amount of code you need by providing implicit iteration. So that's exactly what I just showed you. You notice that when I had a set of elements, I didn't need to call the method on each of them. I didn't need to create a for loop or some type of a loop and then iterate through and call the method over and over again. jQuery is going to do that for you. So let's take a look at an example. Here's a traditional example. And of course, there's a lot of different ways you can select elements and loop through, but this is a common example. I grab some particular element that has an ID of employee search, and I grab all of its child nodes. And what I want to do here is, of all the child nodes that I've got, I want to iterate through each of them. I want to make sure that I'm only grabbing divs that have an attribute of an ID, and I want to make sure that the value of that ID is not number 3. If it satisfies all of those conditions, then I'll change the color to be blue. So you'll notice here I've got my for loop up at the top. I do all my checking, and eventually I change those elements to be blue. jQuery is going to reduce all that code that you see above into one short line. So here below I've got my div, looking for divs with an ID of employee search. I then want all of the div tags that are children, that are descendants of that particular ID. Once I have that, I want to make sure that I'm not getting anything with the ID of number 3. There's all the conditional checks that we had above. Then I say I want to change those that I finally have after I filtered to be the color blue. So again, write less, do more. You take a look at these two examples. This is a great example of the power of jQuery and how much we're able to do with a little bit of code. So that's selecting elements. Let's look at a different area. Let's look at Ajax. There are lots of different Ajax utilities that are provided with jQuery. Some of them are just so that you can make your Ajax requests and handle the responses by yourselves. Others are provided in the plugins, the UI library, so that they'll do things like, the classic examples, autocomplete. You can download a widget where you put on your page, and as people are typing, it will make suggestions as to what it is they're probably looking for. So that's Ajax functionality that's encapsulated inside of a plugin. So jQuery provides both angles here. A real simple and very common Ajax example is where maybe you have some sort of a button and a text field, you want to send some information to a server, and when the server is done processing it, you get the response. You want to put some sort of a message somewhere in the page. So for example, I've got a simple username text box, and I've got a button for submitting a username. And what I want to do is, once that button is clicked, I want to call a JavaScript function called submit username. That's going to handle creating the Ajax request. And that would look something like this. So in my Ajax request, I first have to grab that value. So I grab using document get element by ID. Again, this is the traditional JavaScript example before we show you the jQuery equivalent. So I grab that username, I put it inside of a URL, I construct my object so that I can make an Ajax request. You'll notice here that at the very bottom, I've got a function created, get XML HTTP request. I didn't bother to fill in the code there, but you can imagine that it's custom code to figure out what client browser is being used and what the appropriate XML HTTP request object is for that particular browser, maybe an ActiveX object if it's an older IE browser. But the point being that I need to do a little bit of branching in my code to be able to send this Ajax request for all the browsers I want to support. So again, I have the username, I've created the URL, I've configured my request object, I've registered my callback function. Again, if you're not familiar with Ajax, and this might sound a little strange, but we will be moving on to DOM in just a second, so hold on for the rest of the people. So we have our callback function. Once the callback function is checked, or excuse me, called, I need to check the ready state, because I need to make sure that the request is completed, that it's in number 4. I need to check that status just to make sure that the status is 200. And once that all works out, I grab a particular div, maybe it's a div or a span tag, and I stick in whatever came in the response into that area. So again, very, very typical Ajax scenario. Get a feel for all the code that you see there, and again, remember that final method, get XML HTTP request, I haven't even bothered to put in all the code that would be used to implement that. Here's what it would look like to do the exact same thing in jQuery. This is it. This one line right here does everything we saw above. So what it's going to do is it's going to grab a element, a div element, in this case I call it status, and what I want to do is load some response into it. So .load is the method. The method takes 2 parameters, a URL that you want to call, and optionally you can add a callback function if you need it. But again, for those simple scenarios, you're just really, the only reason we're creating callback functions is simply so that we can load that information into a particular placeholder on our web page. One note about the load method is that the callback function, if you include it, is going to be called even if the request is unsuccessful. So you'll need to handle that appropriately. You'll notice also that I have a method val here. We didn't really talk about that, but val is really the same thing as the .value property in the DOM API. It looks at a particular element and grabs that value out. So the main point being here is, again, jump back to this code. Traditional JavaScript, jQuery. Write less, do more. For some more complex scenarios, you may find that you need other functions, and jQuery does provide them. You should look up the .get, which will execute a GET request, and .post. One main difference between the GET and POST is that you don't attach this to a particular element. They're just global functions that you call. Another difference is that the callback function you would pass in there is not executed if the request is unsuccessful. So that's a little bit about Ajax. Let's jump into the DOM document object model, creation and manipulation. So if we think about typical DOM scenario where we're wanting to create some nodes and eventually put it in a page, there's usually 3 steps. The first step is we need to create each node needed, and that's going to be all of our elements. We may have text nodes, we may have attribute nodes. We need to create each and every one, and then once we have them, we need to assemble these nodes into some sort of a tree structure. Finally, once we have that tree structure, we need to find something in the page that can act as a placeholder or handle and push our tree into that so that it can be displayed. But let's focus on the first 2 steps here. So the first 2 steps, we have a very simple script here where I'm creating a div element, a strong element, and then I also create a text node. Once I've created all the elements that I need, then I can start to arrange them in a tree structure by using the append child method. Again, very simple, very typical scenario. Here's how I can do it in jQuery. A lot simpler. So what I'm able to do here is just put in the text of the strings that I want, and it will create all the elements that I need. So this is the equivalent, what you're seeing here, as what you're seeing in this typical DOM scenario. There is one slight difference that you should keep in mind when you're using the syntax, and that's the way it's really treated under the covers is that it's creating an element and sticking the rest of those other elements you see in here, the div, the strong, the text, hello, and what it's doing is it's putting it as inner HTML. So there are some limitations with that, of course. So there are other methods available that you can use. Remove attribute, add an attribute, prepend, append, insert before, insert after. Let's look at some code examples for these. So here's a very simple DOM example where I've got a div element, some text, and then a child div. And what you see below is just sort of an object representation of this syntax. So I've got my div element right here with the main ID, has a child of some text, also has another child of a div tag as well with its own text. All right, so what will these other methods do? First one I want to show you is prepend to and prepend. I pair these together because they do the same thing. They create the same result. They just go about it in a little different way. And the way that they go about it that's different is really where they're going to stick in their new HTML. So with prepend to, you'll notice the first thing I have is my, here we go. With prepend to, I have the HTML that I want to create. I say dot prepend to, and then I pass in the element where I want to prepend my new text to. Whereas prepend goes in just the exact opposite direction. You start with the element that you want to add all of your new stuff to, and you prepend the new HTML that you've created. In either case, though, it's going to create the same thing. It's going to create some new elements and stick them as the first child of the element that you're sticking them with, in this case, the main div. So that's prepend to and prepend. We have append to and append, and that's going to do pretty much just the opposite. It's going to take the element that you've specified, and it's going to stick it as the very last child for that element. So append to and append. We have insert before, and of course, that's just going to give you a little bit more granularity. You find a particular div. Let's look at the before. In this case, I say I want to find the div with an ID of another div, and before that, I want to stick this brand new HTML. So where does that go? It goes right in the middle. It goes right before this another div element. This is a little bit about the DOM. Let's talk about event handling. So what is an event handling scenario? Events are anything that happens with the elements on your page. So when you click a button, an event happened, an on-click event happened. When you take your mouse and you pass it over an image, a mouse-over event happened. So everything that happens with the interaction on your page, that throws an event. And what do we do with the events? We want to handle them in some sort of way. We want to maybe, when someone clicks a button, we want to call our particular JavaScript function. So we set up event handlers. In traditional JavaScript, there are a couple different ways you can do this programmatically. One way that you could do this is set an event handler property on any HTML element object. So let's say I have a button, and I get it through the get element by ID. Grab that button, and I call .onClick. That's a property that says, hey, whenever this button is clicked, I want you to call the handler that I'm passing by. In this case, I'm setting load new stock quote. The limitation here is that if I call .onClick on the same button again, I will overwrite whatever handlers have been previously set. So you're only allowed to set a single event handler per event type. Now, I could create an inner function here that has multiple event handlers as well, but the main point being as soon as I call .onClick again, I'm going to overwrite what's already there. So if I wanted to add multiple handlers programmatically, then what I would typically do is use a browser-specific method that would allow me to attach multiple handlers. Look at a code example of that. So for example, in IE, I would have a method called attach event. And attach event takes two parameters, event type and event handler. You'll notice that I'm attaching two handlers. One is for an on-click, and another is for an on-mouse over. And what that's going to do is it's just going to keep adding more and more events as I keep attaching them. Problem is that it's not going to be supported in Mozilla. With Mozilla, I'm going to need to use add event listener. And so add event listener has its own syntax where you pass in an event type, event handler, and whether or not you want it to bubble, whether or not you want it to propagate. So before I show you the jQuery solution to this, I want to show you a more common basic event that we're always dealing with, and that's the window.onload. So if we have JavaScript and we try to start working on a page and start manipulating elements on the page, and the entire page hasn't been loaded yet, well, we run into problems, right? So what we typically do is we create an initialization method, and we attach it to the onload event for the window. Again, I could do the window.onload, but that's only going to allow that one handler. If I use that property more than once, it'll keep overwriting. If I want to use the methods we just saw, I could attach event and add event listener. So those cases, I could branch my code depending on the browser and attach whatever I need to the onload property. But how would jQuery handle this? Well, jQuery has a special syntax. Use the $, we pass in the element document, and we say .ready. Anything that we put now inside the as a parameter to the ready method on the document will be called as soon as the page is initialized. So you'll see two examples. One, I have an inner function where I'm able to define the two functions it should call, or I could just keep calling .ready as I need to in my code, and it will conveniently add multiple event handlers for that particular onload function. You'll notice that I'm not branching my code for the different browsers. So it's a nice compact syntax, and you can use it over and over again depending on the browsers. jQuery also provides several other methods to configure event handlers. So there is a .click method and a .focus method. But like the event properties, that will only allow you to be called once without overriding what you had previously said. So we'll look at a couple of ways to deal with that in just a second. So why use this syntax? There are a couple of advantages. Again, I already mentioned that the ready method is called for all supported browsers. You can call it multiple times to add as many handlers as you need. And it is faster than window.onload. Window.onload is going to actually wait until all of the elements in your page have been downloaded. So if you have some slow images, or some bigger images that are on a slower server, your JavaScript isn't going to be called until those images and resources have been completely downloaded. Whereas the ready method will actually call as soon as the markup and scripts have been loaded. So it won't wait for those slow resources. Just a quick example of table, of some of the common event handlers. So we have like .click and .submit, .focus. If you're familiar with event handling in HTML, you can pretty much guess what the names of these event handler methods would be. And we have an example right below that where I've got my stock button and I'm saying, hey, on the click event, I want you to call load new stock quote. That's one way you can do it, but if you want to add multiple event handlers to a single event type, there's another method that's provided. That's the bind method. The bind method has two parameters. The first is the type of event that you want to bind to, and then the handler. You'll notice there's an optional .name syntax, and I will get to that in just a minute. But we have two examples below here where I've got the stock button, and I'm binding a click event handler, load new stock quote, and then I call it again, and I bind change stock image. So again, that's not going to override. That's just going to keep adding more and more event handlers to this particular event. So let's look at the example if we don't use this .name parameter. So if I go back here, you'll notice I've got an optional syntax where I say I can call bind, I can say the name of the type, but I can also add .name. So what's the purpose of that .name? It's really for managing when you want to add and remove programmatically specific event handlers. So without an identifier, I have what we just saw here. I have my click, and I add load new stock quote, and I add another click event handler, and that one goes to change stock image. As soon as I call the method unbind, which is going to remove the event handlers for a particular event for a particular element, what is it going to do? Well, it's going to get rid of both of those event handlers, and that may be exactly what you want. But sometimes you want to be more specific. You want to say, hey, I want to unbind the change stock image and not the load new stock quote. So how would you go about doing that? In this case, what you do is use that .name identifier. And the identifier can be anything you want. So it could be click.load and click.change, as I have in this example. It could be click.json and click.intertech, if that actually makes sense. So it's whatever name you want to give. And the way that you use it is when you call unbind, you use the fully qualified name. In this case, if I want to get rid of load new stock quote, I just say unbind click.load, and everything else that has been bound to that particular element for the particular click event will remain intact. It's a little bit about events. Let's talk about styles and effects. So I already showed you a method in previous examples where I showed you CSS, and I explained a little bit about implicit iteration. So CSS is just a nice way where I can say, hey, for this set of elements, I want to change a particular style. It could also be a map of styles. So you see two examples here where I call CSS twice for a specific element, or below I use JSON and I create a map of styles. So you can do whatever you want for there. But there are other methods that are available as well. In fact, for the most part, you're probably not going to be affecting individual styles. You're probably going to be adding and removing classes. And so jQuery provides three really nice methods for this. We have add class, and you can have a comma separated, a space separated name. So all the classes that you want to add to a particular element, you simply list them inside of this method. Or remove class if I want to take out specific classes for an element. And then toggle class. Toggle class is just a nice way of turning something on and off for a style. Here's an example of that. Start at the bottom here. So at the bottom, I have my body tag, and I have a div element. Some text called some text, and it has a class of make it red. And I have a button, and my button says toggle the style. You'll notice that I did not put an on-click handler here. What I'm going to do is after the document is ready, I'm going to attach programmatically a handler, the click handler, to this button. So in my script, you'll see that I have my document.ready. That's what's going to be called when everything's ready to go. I pass in init. That's the function I want called. And here's where I'm actually binding now that click event handler. I say, hey, find that element with the ID of toggle. I want you to bind. And what are we going to bind? We're going to bind the click event. And I want to set toggle style as that event handler. So what happens every time I click? Well, it grabs the main div, and it calls toggle class. And you'll notice that the class I've added here is invert style. So what it's going to do is every time I click the button, it's going to add the style, it's going to remove the style, it's going to add the style, remove the style. And that's what you see below. Another example of effects. Here's a bunch of different effects that they have. Fade in, fade out, slide up, slide down, hide, show. So a lot of CSS tricks that we do, they made very easy through function calls. So here's an example of something fading in. I have a element here. The div ID is main div. I have some text in there. So what I do is I say, grab that main div, let's hide it, and once we've hidden it, let's start to fade it in slowly. So you have two different attributes you can use here, slow or quick. Slow or fast, excuse me. And so we hide it, it starts to fade in. Here's an example of method chaining. And that's a real common example. So we don't have to keep writing $pound main div dot hide, $pound main div dot fade in. We can just put that all together. So that's a common effect. Here's another one where we can slide up or slide down. In this case, I just say, again, grab that main div and slide it on up. Let's go slow. Couldn't be any simpler. And it will do a little bit of an animation where when you click it, the text moves up until it disappears. Those are some effects. What about widgets? Well, widgets are part of what jQuery calls plugins. And there are third-party plugins that you can download. If you want to find out about a lot of different plugin repositories, you can go to a website that's plugins.jQuery.com. You'll see a whole bunch of different plugins like autocomplete and whatnot registered there. But the main library, the main set of widgets and plugins that are provided by the jQuery core is called the jQuery UI library. It's maintained by the jQuery project just like the jQuery core. The UI library that they provide will have widgets, it'll have themes, animations, and other effects. This library is not part of that jQuery core. So what we saw at the beginning of this presentation, you're not going to have these available to you. You will need to do an additional download. So whenever you want to grab these, you go to jQueryUI.com. And you'll see a screen that's very similar to what you see in the screenshot below. And it asks you, hey, what do you need from me? What should you build? And the reason it's asking you to build your download is so it can provide you with the smallest deliverable possible. And the way that you start to find out about what you need for your project is you start looking at some of your widgets on this website. And when you look at the overview, you'll see a list of dependencies. Those are the things you're going to need to download from that particular page. So you pick out all of the different widgets that you want, you download them, you have your package. The different types of components that you have available through this library. We've got the UI core. This is just really the base classes for all the different plugins. There are different interactions, so you can do dragging and dropping, and you can do sorting. There are widgets such as tabs, progress bars. I'll show you an example of a date picker. And more special effects. We saw some fade in and fade out that are provided by the core, but if you want something like explode or shake or highlight, those you're going to need to down as an additional download through this UI library or through some other third-party plugin. Also, in addition to choosing some components, you can select predefined themes. Those themes will provide a uniform look and feel for all of your components. There's literally dozens to choose from at this UI library website. All right, so you've looked at all the widgets, all the themes, all the things that you want to download. You've looked at their dependencies and you've made notes. You've gone back to that web page and the main web page and chosen which elements you want to download. And what it's going to give you is a big zip file. And that zip file is going to contain many folders. It'll have JavaScript files, CSS files, images, and so on. And what you'll want to do is unzip that file, put it into your web project directory, wherever it is that may exist. And then you'll need to go into your page and add links to the jQuery CSS and the JavaScript files. Now, if you're not exactly sure what you need to add, they have a nice index.html sample file in there. Just take a look at the top and see what scripts are they adding, what links are they adding, and copy that into your web application. So once I have that, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to actually use whatever it is I downloaded. So here's an example of using a date picker. So what is a date picker? It's instead of having people hand type a date, a little calendar pops up and they're able to click on a date and it formats it in the way that we need for our particular application. So in this case, I say, let's put something on my page, just an input text box. I give it an ID of date picker, and that would normally be just a regular text box, so I need to give it a little bit of additional functionality through jQuery. So in jQuery, I say, hey, select that date picker, and .date picker. Couldn't be any easier, right? So once I do that, let's take a look at what we have. Here's an example. As soon as I click into that text box, a little calendar will pop up, allowing the user to select the date they want. Now, of course, there's more additional things that you can do to this calendar date picker. If I want different styles, how I want that date to be formatted once they select the date. Maybe I want to give a range of specific dates that are available. All those can be done and custom set through the UI library. For complete documentation and demos of the UI library, you can go to jQueryUI.com/demos. All right, it is 1 o'clock, so I know some of you have to drop off at this point. I want to thank you for your time. If the rest of you want to just hold on for just a minute, I'll try to get to a few of your questions. But here are some jQuery resources that we have available. And again, there's going to be an email that's sent out to you guys later where you can download these slides. That's why I'm going through them, some of these links a little bit quickly. But we also have some free learning options here at Intertech. So we've got blogs. I mentioned we have Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn. Really encourage you to sign up to those resources. This is where we announce a lot of our free classes, such as the one you've taken today. All right, so what did you learn today? You learned what jQuery is and why you should care. We looked at the basic setup, where you're able to download jQuery, the difference between the production and the development versions, what you need to add to your web project code so that you're able to use the JavaScript file. We looked at the basic syntax, where we saw what the jQuery identifiers are, the $sign and the jQuery identifier, and part of the syntax of method chaining. We looked at different technical areas of jQuery, selecting elements, something we do over and over again on our web pages. We saw that they have different Ajax utilities available for us, a simple way of handling DOM creation, traversion, and manipulation. Looked at how we're able to bind and unbind different events to different elements of jQuery. And, of course, how to add styles, effects, and different widgets. So on behalf of myself and Intertech, I do want to thank you all for joining us. And just remind you again, Intertech, we have a lot of free content. If check out the resources I just mentioned before. Also, I encourage you to go to our webpage and sign up for our newsletter. The registration for the newsletter is at the bottom of the homepage. I'm going to mention this a little bit before. I am a trainer myself here at Intertech, and one of the classes I'm really trying to push here is the Ajax class. I'm very, very, very excited about that. So if you enjoyed today's seminar, I encourage you to check out the complete Ajax for Java class that I am offering. But we've got a lot of different training available for us, and we do the format delivery in many different ways. We have instructor-led public and on-site classes. We have night classes. We do virtual classes, which you're doing right here. And we are also starting to offer self-paced studies. If you have any questions on this, feel free to send me an email or give a call to 651-994-8558. In addition to training, we also offer consulting here at Intertech. Our brand here is instructors who consult, consultants who teach. So there's a lot of cross-pollination here at Intertech. We do offer services, everything from the developer to the architect. So again, for more information on that, please call 651-994-8558. And at this point, I'm going to try to take a few questions here. If you have a question, you can add that at the top of your meeting. There should be a Q&A where you're able to add questions. And let me see what I can answer here.
While you're going through those questions, Jason, this is Dan again. Just a reminder, this session was recorded, so we will make the session available for playback probably later today. As well, we'll provide a link for the slide downloads in that same email. So thank you again for joining, and back to you, Jason.
All right, let me take a look at some questions here. Question is, does jQuery work on iPhone and iPad versions of Safari? I have not tried iPad personally. I have seen sites work with Safari on the iPhone. The thing about jQuery is that it's JavaScript. I mean, it's just a library that's built around JavaScript, so it's not a new programming language that the phone needs to be aware of. Looking through the questions here. I'm sorting through a few questions here. They're asking when to get the presentation. So what is the best book for jQuery, or is the online documentation enough? I listed in the resources section of this presentation some of my personal favorite books on jQuery. Here's what I found through my research, that the documentation on the jQuery site is really, really good in terms of being able to understand the syntax of a particular function. In terms of looking at the bigger picture, I found that the books that I've recommended did a lot better job at that. you'll get to a point where you'll be like, all right, I get it. I get the different types of functionality that are out there. There's selection, there's DOM traversals, there's events, there's Ajax utilities. And once you get a really good feel for that, you're probably going to just start to rely on the online documentation at the jQuery org site itself. But again, the books that I've mentioned inside of this presentation are ones that I do highly recommend. So the question isn't a version of jQuery included in Visual Studio? Yes. And I only know this because I was told by the .NET instructors. I am a Java instructor, so I'm not completely familiar with all the stuff that's happening in the .NET world. But yes, jQuery, if it's not already there, it's coming as part of the .NET Visual Studio. Does jQuery work with Java server faces? Well, absolutely. So Java server faces is a framework that's really dealing with everything that's coming in through the request. You're binding to, backing beans in your application. jQuery is really just about what's going to happen on the client side. So it's about client-side rendering. You're really just dealing with the view for the most part in terms of model view controller architecture. So yes, absolutely, jQuery will work really well with Java server faces. How does jQuery handle return values from functions? If there is a return value, it's just like any other function. You're just going to have some sort of an identifier, some variable that captures whatever's returned. But for the most part, most of the jQuery functions are going to return a handle to itself. So if I have, for example, a set of elements and I call a function like hide on those set of elements, what's returned to me is the handle of that set of elements, and that's what permits us to be able to do method chaining. What is the difference from Ajax frameworks and jQueries? jQuery provides us methods for handling Ajax. So in a way, you could say it is an Ajax framework. It doesn't strictly just do Ajax. I guess the main difference is that if you're not doing any Ajax, you can still really benefit by using jQuery. If you are using Ajax, well, you still can benefit through jQuery. So it's a JavaScript framework that does additionally handle Ajax for you as well. Any books that I know of that work specifically with jQuery and Google Earth Maps? No, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with any books that specifically deal with that. Can we integrate jQuery within an existing GWT? So GWT is the Google Web Toolkit. You can add in GWT any arbitrary JavaScript that you want, and you can add any arbitrary HTML. So you can, as far as points of integration between the two where they're calling each other, that might take a little bit more work, but really not any more work than when you integrate with any of your other legacy code, any legacy JavaScript code that you would want to integrate with GWT. For those who haven't looked at GWT, it's pretty cool. GWT is it's Java. You write all of your code in Java, and it generates all the JavaScript for you. So why have both a prepend and prepend to and the like? If you look at jQuery, there are actually a lot of ways to do the same thing. So really, it just becomes a preference. That's all I can say. It's really just a preference. I pick a style and stick with it. I happen to like using the prepend to and the append to, and I just stick with that particular syntax. There's just a lot of different options available, and you choose what works best for you. So my thoughts on jQuery versus other JavaScript frameworks such as YUI, MooTools, and Dojo, and all that kind of stuff. The bottom line is that most of the frameworks out there do their job very, very well. They provide widgets. They provide Ajax functionality. YUI has a really nice library. Dojo does some great work as well in terms of their libraries. So I like them all for different reasons, but I'll tell you why I like jQuery the best. And that's, again, the motto that I keep saying over and over again, write less, do more. I have not found any other framework that really works on reducing the amount of code I need to write at this kind of a level. And it's so clean. The interface is so clean. When, I mentioned once you finally get a handle on the different areas of functionality, you read a good book on, examples of how to implement this, you're just going to find yourself at the online documentation. And that's because the methods are cleanly named. Everything is very obvious in how it should work. At least that's been my experience with jQuery. So how do they compare to others? Other frameworks are great with widgets, but nothing really compares with jQuery's ability to reduce code. Let's just take one more here. Just taking a quick look. This is an interesting question. I noticed that once you've selected an element with jQuery, it doesn't seem like you can use native JavaScript methods on it, such as chaining. Is there a way around that? You should be able to. There's a couple ways you could go around that. You're right. You're not going to be able to do chaining because that's something very specific to jQuery, unless your library happens to return, it takes in the selection as a parameter and returns it explicitly. You're right. That's going to be jQuery specific. But there's a few ways that you could get around that. If you wanted to use some other function, grab the selection and pass it as a parameter to the function. Maybe that function turns it into a variable that you're able to use and pass to other functions as well. But you're right, you're not going to be able to do the method chaining unless your particular function grabs that selection and then returns it every time it's being called. So I know that there's a few more questions that are still out there. What I'm going to encourage you to do is send them to me as email. I'm more than happy to answer them. You can send that to jshapiro@intertech.com. But with that, again, I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I hope you found this helpful. And, and please, actually, if you have some time, there's my address, jshapiro@intertech.com. Send me some feedback. I'd love to know what worked and what didn't work for you with this presentation. So thanks again.